The girl pulled away from her fiancé in confusion because his gaze usually had the usual gray, dim light. Audrey stepped closer, wondering anxiously what was wrong with his eyes, asking worriedly if he was in pain and what was going on. The man lowered his head, trying to control himself, while Aurora clarified whether he could have been chained here because he was a pervert. Jeffrey suddenly growled that she was right, but he still spoke indistinctly without raising his head, and the girl asked again in surprise what he was talking about. Raising his head, the fair-haired man even smiled a little, and, although his face was covered in sweat, calmly asked the bride to come closer. Looking at him, Audrey obediently came closer and asked if he was joking, because then the key could have been in his pocket while the Duke was asking her to come closer. She muttered thoughtfully that if he was sick, he should spend time in his bed, but the man suddenly literally tore the handcuffs out of the wall. When Aurora called Jeffrey's name, confused and even a little frightened, he sank to the floor, tightly gripping her elbows with his strong fingers. The end result of this torture was the same. All rational thoughts of the Duke disappeared, and after them came a terrible thirst for blood. All a man could do, and usually did, was to wait for dawn alone and locked up, endure pain and his secret desires. He leaned on the girl, and she quietly said that the Duke was, in fact, very heavy, and it would be better to move away a little. There was no longer a whisper in his head. Now the fair-haired man only wanted to be as close as possible to the one who had managed to calm his enormous thirst. Blushing at the man's closeness, Aurora pulled back a little, calling her fiancé by name again, and then asked if he had come to his senses. The girl noticed that he seemed to have come to his senses and could now rise from her, and Ettica immediately rose, asking forgiveness from his bride. As she followed him up, Audrey asked him to forget about the apology, muttering that he seemed possessed, immediately asking what happened. She froze when she heard that they could talk about it later, and then the man added that for now it would be much better for her to leave. Jeffrey suddenly began to push her towards the door, although not painfully, but noticeably strongly, and Aurora asked him to stop in surprise. Slipping in her slippers, the pink-haired girl slipped and leaned her back against the man, immediately gasping and causing him to stop. The girl turned around and hastened to explain that her foot had simply slipped, but the Duke did not seem to change his mind about her leaving. The bride froze with her hands raised up when the man suddenly fell on her, exhaling loudly, and could hardly utter a word. Audrey quietly asked what he was doing, because it wasn't funny at all, but the blonde man closed his eyes, silently lying on her shoulder. A little later, she was already dragging Jeffrey out of the dungeon, throwing his broad arm over her thin shoulder, wondering why she was doing this. Collapsing onto the wide bed with her fiancé, Aurora screamed tiredly that he was just a damn mountain of muscle, and she thought she was going to die. Bringing her heavy breathing back to normal, the girl quietly rejoiced that, at least, the shackles on her fiancé's hands came off very easily. Audrey wondered if they were magical, because she just touched them and they opened without even having to look for the key. The pink-haired girl slowly sat up on the bed and touched the wound on her leg, quietly whispering that this paresis stung terribly. The girl didn't know if he had a first aid kit in his chambers, and then she stood up and opened the shelf of the nightstand, looking at it to see if it was there. Aurora folded her arms across her chest, frowning slightly and muttering that she had no idea what things were for what. She decided not to bother with such devices and just wrap up the small wound and took out something like a medical bandage. While wrapping her foot, the pink-haired girl quietly hissed, but mentally calmed herself down, noting that everything seemed to be working out well. Aurora was distracted and turned to look at Jeffrey because he was quietly groaning with his eyes closed, and it was unclear how he was feeling. The girl reached out to him and gently touched his forehead, brushing his hair away and whispering how the man felt. Removing her hand from his face, Audrey returned to her seat and muttered that the groom seemed to have calmed down, although his condition did not seem stable at all. Thinking that Jeffrey looked better and calmer when they touched each other, Aurora gently took his hand with her slender fingers. As his strong palm squeezed her hand, the girl smiled a little and thought that this approach really seemed to be working. Without really paying attention to her thoughts, the future Duchess thought that his skin was cold and pleasant to the touch, even if the man himself was hot. Audrey immediately jumped back, slapped her cheeks, and blushed brightly, not understanding what she was saying and trying to bring herself to her senses. A few seconds later, the man groaned in pain again, and the pink-haired girl leaned towards him, touching his hand again. Gently stroking Jeffrey's strong palm, Aurora wondered if she would have to stay here overnight. The next morning, the young people were already sleeping in an embrace on a wide bed, and their bodies were covered with a warm gray-blue down blanket. Waking up to the bright sunlight, Ettica pulled his bride closer to him and covered her with a blanket so that the girl would not wake up. The pink-haired girl seemed like a forest nymph in this pleasant light. She breathed calmly and measuredly, without opening her eyes and not even thinking of interrupting her sleep. The fair-haired man thought with surprise that everything that happened yesterday was not just a dream, and sat up on the bed, tenderly stroking her cheek. Lifting the blanket slightly and examining his bride for the amount of damage, Jeffrey decided that the girl did not look injured. Getting out of the warm bed and standing up, the Duke pulled on a loose white robe and walked forward, calling his adjutant by name. The young man, delighted by the fact that the boss and his bride were now so close, raised his fist in triumph and responded to his holiness. Turning around, the man seemed to be in a less than friendly mood and asked him to come over because they needed to talk. Jeffrey said he seemed to realize he was in trouble and said he better have a good explanation. Falling to his knees, Wendell begged for forgiveness, then said that he had removed the guard at the lady's door the previous night and allowed her to find her fiancé. The guy said that the girl was not affected by Phrenesis's magic, and therefore he had a hunch that she might have abilities. Listening attentively to his assistant, the fair-haired man muttered sullenly that it was just a guess, and a rather dangerous one. Jeffrey folded his arms across his chest and asked if Wendell had allowed the girl to approach him with absolutely no guarantee of safety. The young man stated that he had indeed put Milady in danger, but even if there was a tiny chance, one could not just stand and do nothing. The Duke exhaled loudly and rubbed his face with his palm, leaning his back against the wall, and then said that he had never asked him for anything like that. Exhaling, the young man bowed and muttered that he was ready to accept any punishment because he had initially understood how the boss would react to this. Turning around, the fair-haired man suggested that the lady herself put forward the idea of punishment and called Aurora, saying that now was the time to go out. The pink-haired girl pursed her lips awkwardly and exhaled, then looked out from her hiding place and hesitantly asked how he found out. Jeffrey shrugged and said that, as he had said, he had exceptional hearing, and Audrey muttered that she remembered, but she didn't think it was that good. Noticing the wound on the bride's leg, the man asked why she was wearing a rag, and she objected, saying that it was medical gauze. When Ettica asked if she was hurt, Aurora shook her head and explained that it was just a small cut from the glass, nothing serious. Immediately asking for forgiveness, the blonde man picked her up in his arms, and then the girl blushed, asking what he was doing because it was not necessary. The Duke turned his head and ordered Wendell to bring the ointment, as his punishment would have to wait, and the young man quickly replied that he would do it in a moment. Sitting the girl down on the sofa, Jeffrey apologized to her again, but she hastened to inform him that she was fine and that she really wasn't in that much pain. The man seemed annoyed and more attentive than usual, and then said that the bride had suffered because of him, and that was bad. Still half in his arms, the pink-haired girl looked at her fiancé's face, trying to figure out what was causing him such concern. Deciding to take a step in a more productive direction, Aurora said that if he was truly sorry, he could tell her the truth. Having rebandaged her leg, the blonde man asked the girl to be patient for a little while, and that she should not move while the special medicine was taking effect. Already sitting at the table, Audrey asked if he could answer her question now that they had finally dealt with the wound on her leg. Catching his breath, Jeffrey shook his head and looked down, muttering that he would call this all his punishment. He said that once a month he was forced to experience pain similar to yesterday's, and along with it, he was overcome by the desire to smash everything to pieces. The man added that he could not allow anyone to be hurt, and therefore he restrained himself, similar to the case she had seen yesterday. The pink-haired girl didn't think that the Duke would open up to her so easily, and so she froze a little, immediately asking if he was okay now. Jeffrey handed his bride a plate and added that it usually lasted about 3 days, and Aurora asked why he punished himself. The girl noted that, among other things, when she touched him, the groom seemed calmer, asking why this was so. Shrugging, Ettica said he didn't know the reason, but it started a few years ago, and all he knew was that it passed by morning. The blonde muttered thoughtfully that he didn't understand why he calmed down in such a state when his bride touched him. Aurora froze with her fork to her mouth when the man said that he didn't want to know, and then asked why he was saying it that way. Without looking up from his food, the Duke said that he simply did not want to involve her in this, immediately hearing the question of whether he liked this pain. Jeffrey asked her not to interfere with this because she would not like his company, and he could not guarantee the girl's safety. The pink-haired girl said that if she didn't help him, the man would make noise, but he suggested that she use another room. Aurora asked why not just use the highly effective human painkiller that was right there. Ettica suddenly put his fork down on the table with a bang, hitting it slightly, and was clearly outraged when he heard about a human painkiller. Rising from his seat and pushing his chair back, the man asked if she had expected more, and Audrey asked, confused, what he was talking about. The fair-haired man asked with open mockery whether his bride really hoped that the Duke would simply collapse and beg at her feet. When Aurora angrily asked who he took her for, the man said that he despised people who tried to take advantage of his weakness. The pink-haired girl was very depressed by what she heard, her eyes widening as he added that he was warning her that this idea should be abandoned immediately. She leaned forward sharply and called him little, ungrateful, pointing her index finger at the groom, and this could not fail to surprise him. The girl said that she was absolutely sure that when she fell asleep, she was still sitting on the bed next to him, but in the morning, she was already in his strong arms. Aurora became angry and stated that she may have fallen into his arms, but she was not the one who hugged him as if his life depended on it. Jeffrey suddenly asked how long she had been awake, and the pink-haired girl fell silent, slightly removing her hand from him and mentally calculating everything. Their awkward conversation, which was going nowhere, was interrupted by a knock on the door, and Ettica turned around, sighing loudly and asking someone to come in. Looking at the man, who was dressed in a suit and standing in the doorway, the Duke asked what he wanted, and he replied that he was a messenger from the Emperor's palace. Ettica was clearly not pleased with what he heard, and then drew his eyebrows together, echoing the question about the messenger. A little later, already in the spacious hall, the Duke said that he had not thought that His Majesty's Chamberlain would make such a long journey. The man introduced his bride, and she nodded to the guest, saying that she was pleased to meet him and introducing herself as Aurora Audrey. Bowing, the envoy declared that he served under His Majesty, the Light of Nodelberg, calling himself Count Evanson. The blonde man suggested finishing quickly, hugging his bride, and she, giggling, said that she knew about his insatiability, but she needed to listen to the man. Getting straight to the point, the Count reported that His Majesty had ordered them both to immediately bring Count Barbarius and appear in the capital. He handed the invitation to the Duke, who began to read, and the pink-haired girl covered her face with her hand, trying to appear more excited. She laughed softly and said that she seemed to be going too, and the groom turned to her, trying to figure out if this looked like overacting. The Count added that the young men should leave within the day, and then asked them to prepare for it accordingly. Aurora laughed a little and whispered that he had 2 more nights of punishment ahead of him, and Jeffrey asked if that was so funny. Ettica stated that such a reason for the trip was absurd, but he had no right to disobey the order and had to show his face. Later, the fair-haired man muttered that he was forced to go to the capital because someone supported Nephthys's plan, and the girl replied that this was how it was intended. Audrey said she was very compassionate and would be happy to be his pain reliever again if a man asked politely. Rising from his seat, the Duke bowed, and turning to Aurora, asked him to take advantage of her strange abilities. The pink-haired girl thought she would be delighted when she saw this guy bending over, but her soul was filled with a completely different, unpleasant feeling. Meanwhile, the maids gathered in a small circle and began to very quietly discuss the latest events that had taken place in the castle. Angela approached them, barely audibly shifting from foot to foot, and once again confirming her status as a strange girl among them. Stepping straight up to one of her colleagues, the blue-haired maid whispered to ask where Mistress Aurora had gone this morning. The girl squealed in fear and moved away, saying that she had been frightened, and then asked to repeat the question, which she had not heard. Recalling the events of this morning, Angela said that Lady Audrey was not in the room today, asking those who saw her to raise their hands. The blonde maid covered her mouth with her hand and asked if her interlocutor hadn't heard about the latest news. Angela's eyes widened in surprise when she heard from the maids that his lordship and my Lady Aurora had slept together that night. After some time, the maid had already reached the required room and opened the heavy doors to find out everything. The first thing she noticed was Wendell in front of her, sitting with his arms around his knees, the young man clearly very upset about something. When the girl asked why he was crying, the Duke's adjutant lost his composure and burst into tears, saying that he had put the lady in danger. The maid looked at him with confusion, asking how exactly the assistant could have put his lordship's bride in danger. A little later, the girl was already standing in front of the engaged couple, saying that the greenie had told her that he had endangered Lady Audrey. Angela held a chain to a clearly beaten young man who was suggesting they discuss things more peacefully and stated that she was still very angry. Looking at the face of the already unhappy guy, Aurora assumed that he had been dealt a pretty blow, immediately asking whether the maid had heard the whole story. The maid growled with indignation at her mistress and explained to her that the more she heard from the assistant, the angrier she became at him. The pink-haired girl asked if the girl had heard about Jeffrey, and she replied that she now knew that he regularly lost his mind. Without taking offense, Ettica muttered that it was impressive and then asked who the girl was before she became a simple maid. Having received the answer that no one, the fair-haired man looked at her with displeasure and asked how she had then made Wendell tell everything. Giving the guy a little tug by the collar, Angela said that he began to yap after a few blows, asking what his punishment would be. With a loud sigh, the man said that it depended only on his mistress, and then closed his eyes and suggested asking Lady Aurora. With his arms folded across his chest, Jeffrey turned and asked his bride if she had thought of anything, and the girl replied that she had an idea. Angela stepped back from the young man, and when the future Duchess addressed the adjutant by his first and last name, he pulled himself together and bowed. Aurora looked at the guy and said that she had spent quite a long time thinking about what to do with him. Wendell agreed when he heard his mistress suggest that he did it out of loyalty to Jeffrey, though that was no excuse. She said that because of this incident, she lost faith in him and therefore no longer wants the young man to be responsible for everything related to her. Audrey spoke quite ingratiatingly and calmly, observing the reactions of those around her, and then asked if her fiancé's adjutant understood this. He bowed, folded his hands, and replied that of course he understood everything, and the pink-haired girl smiled slightly, but immediately added that there was something else. Ettica watched silently as the girl said that her previous words were more of a request, which meant that he did not receive any punishment. Wendell turned pale and almost literally felt like he was in the worst nightmare when he heard that Angela would be his temporary boss. Aurora summed it up as a punishment for him, and Jeffrey even moved away from the cup, muttering that it was very merciful. Towering over her new charge, Angela said she couldn't wait for it to be true. Looking at the young man with a threatening look in her eyes, the maid said quite calmly that they would still have plenty of fun after such an order from the mistress. Later, during the preparations, the Count asked where Barbarius was, and the Duke asked him not to worry, because he was already on his way. The bride asked with open surprise why they were in such a hurry, and he stated that the Emperor, apparently, was very impatient. A sullen Jeffrey declared that it was because of His Majesty's stubbornness, and the girl thought that he must like this idea. The blonde man exhaled and warned that it would be inconvenient, and Aurora said that nothing could be done because it was an imperial order. Tapping his knees, the man said that if the girl needed a place to rest, she should not be shy about using his legs. Receiving no reaction, the Duke immediately looked at her with displeasure, as if saying that the bride had better get into character as soon as possible. Playfully, but actually strongly, hitting him in the chest with her fist, the pink-haired girl said that she was simply so excited that she couldn't even find the words. Catching her hand right after that, Jeffrey muttered that Aurora was simply charming, although in reality they were ready to kill each other. They began to chatter about the Count being watched, and that they had better slip away, and the man hastened to say that it was time for him to take his leave and that they would meet later. A few moments later, the carriage was already leaving the courtyard of the ducal castle, the huge wheels clattering along with the horses' hooves. After a short conversation, the blonde noted that the bride hit him hard for self-defense, and she replied that something like that would not kill him. Just after finishing her sentence, the pink-haired girl looked back and glanced at him, muttering that he didn't look his best. The girl gently asked if he got motion sickness, and the man shook his head, loosening the collar of his green shirt a little. Jeffrey exhaled loudly and said that it was just one of the symptoms of his curse, after which Aurora hummed thoughtfully, looking at him. The bride gently touched his strong hand, which lay on the carriage seat, with her thin fingers and squeezed it a little to help him. Ettica asked what she was doing, and the pink-haired girl asked if it was helping, and then asked her not to lie because she saw everything with her own eyes. Raising her index finger, she said with expertise and confidence that she herself could feel when there was an effect. Aurora said that after this, a pleasant feeling of coolness arose around the Duke, and he asked if this was true. Audrey nodded a couple of times and asked the man not to think that this simple action was stressing her out, asking if he agreed with this. When the blonde thanked her and then said that he wished they had met earlier, the girl pulled back slightly and blushed brightly. Turning her head, the pink-haired girl said, as if she felt like they were destined to meet at some point, even if it wasn't like a fairy tale. She stroked his hand and asked if it was strange that they had abilities that could help each other, even if it wasn't a romantic connection. Jeffrey listened to the girl with surprise, and then his eyes widened when he heard that she would still remain next to him. Looking at how smiling and open she was at that moment, the man said that one day the girl would regret taking his hand. A little later, a small camp was already set up in the forest, and the firewood, which was lined with large boulders, caught fire. Jeffrey and Aurora sat on the ground, hugging each other, and the man carefully covered his bride with a woolen cloak so that she would not freeze. Calling his assistant, Campbell, who immediately came out from behind a tree and responded, the Duke asked him how things were going with Wendell. Looking back at the young man, who had been at the mercy of a strict maid all day, and at Angela herself, the man said that he had been crying all day. Pressing his already peacefully sleeping bride to his chest, the fair-haired man assumed that this meant that the young man had met his soulmate. Ettica turned his head slightly and said that she had better be kept an eye on, and Sir Campbell asked if he meant the maid. Jeffrey confirmed this and looked thoughtfully at the fire, mentally pondering who this strange servant could be. Looking down and examining the pink-haired bride, the man also stated that more information wouldn't hurt them. Much later, on the way to the capital, the fair-haired man who was shielding her face from the sun's rays asked if she was awake. Immediately jumping up from her place, namely from the groom's feet, Aurora blushed brightly and asked why she was sleeping on his lap at all. When the carriage was already entering the city, the Duke reported that after stopping at the camp, she had slept too soundly, and he decided not to wake her. Tapping her fingers on her lips, the girl said that in that case everything was fine, trying to drive the blush from her cheeks and saying that it was nothing. Jeffrey changed the subject and nodded towards the window, informing her that she had woken up just in time for the fun to finally begin. The man said without much enthusiasm that they had arrived at a golden palace, and his eyes really did sting from the abundance of sparkling materials. Once inside, Aurora hugged her future husband by the elbow and thought in horror about whether all this gold could really be real. She muttered that she felt like a tourist, and Jeffrey replied that His Majesty the Emperor had ordered this palace to be built. Explaining that it was built using cheap labor and military wealth, the Duke added that the place represented victory. The man added that the castle was also known for its huge number of servants, and the girl wondered if he was going to give a lecture. The pink-haired girl whispered and asked why he was telling her all this, and Ettica replied that he just thought he would be a guide for the tourist. She asked if it was okay to say all this when they were not alone, and the blonde man replied that everyone knew his reputation, and therefore there was no need to worry. The Count, who was not very pleased with what he heard, but ignored it, pointed with his hand into the room and announced that the future newlyweds should go there. The young people stopped at the entrance to a luxurious room, under the ceiling of which hung a huge chandelier, and the roof was transparent. Muttering that the chambers were simply stunning, Aurora wondered why the Emperor, who did not like the Duke, was giving him such a room. The Count said that this was the Chamber of Light, in which all the lamps and decoration were made of diamonds, and the floor was made of precious ores that diffused the brilliance of the sun. Stepping forward, the pink-haired girl even turned pink with delight, stating that it looked magical and asking if Jeffrey thought so too. The man did not answer, and turning to his companion, he suggested that an audience would soon take place, to which the latter responded in agreement. After the Earl left, Audrey asked if everyone in the palace received such rooms, and the Duke replied evasively that it could be called special treatment. Turning his head towards the bride, the blonde man said that there was a small mistake in the conclusion, and this room was not good at all. Aurora looked at her fiancé with incomprehension, who seemed to her to be simply a skeptic, and he added that the girl would soon understand everything. 3 hours later, when the sun was at its highest point, the room was practically a furnace for melting. It was terribly hot. The wet, pink-haired girl asked if the Emperor wanted them to be boiled alive, and Jeffrey muttered that it was the ruler's nasty hobby. Turning around, the future Duchess asked why he hadn't said anything while she was making a fool of herself in front of the Count. With a bored sigh, the blonde man stated that, judging by his previous experience, he could confidently say that the wait would be in vain. Aurora cried out that they had been waiting for 3 hours already, asking if after this they could simply be turned around and sent back. Ettica folded his arms over his chest and said that this was a very real outcome, and the pink-haired girl asked how he survived working for the Emperor. The Duke noticed that his future bride was indeed feeling unwell and offered a solution to the problem, holding out his palm to her. Audrey looked at the man with confusion, then asked if he was experiencing symptoms again and took his hand. Jeffrey calmly replied that that was not the case, and a refreshing, cool stream of air washed over the girl, bringing her to her senses. Mentally wondering if it was magic on his part, the pink-haired girl looked down, and the Duke asked if she was feeling better. As far as she knew from the book's plot, Ettica did not belong to the family of magicians or wizards, and therefore his abilities were a mystery. Sighing wearily, Aurora promised that she would question him about it later, and the man, who was not feeling much better, agreed. She immediately thanked him and said that she could breathe again, wondering if he won all the battles with more than just a sword. Looking at the man's thoughtful expression, the pink-haired girl wondered how he could have died in the novel if he had powers. When there was a knock at the door, the girl happily noticed that someone had arrived, but Geoffrey stood up and asked her not to even hope. The servant entered, apologized for the disturbance, and said that due to His Majesty's busy schedule, there would be no audience today. They were asked to come another day. Audrey looked at the butler with displeasure, while her fiancé asked what about Count Barbarius. The man replied that His Majesty would personally take care of this, and Ettica clarified, asking again whether he was considered a criminal. When the servant mumbled something unintelligible, the fair-haired man interrupted him and said that they agreed to return tomorrow, asking him to convey his regards. Soon, the future newlyweds left the Golden Palace, which brought them nothing but time spent in the terrible heat. Holding her fingers to her groom's elbow, Aurora replied with displeasure that all they had done was take the vile Roland away from them. Looking down at the girl, Ettica said that for a peaceful resolution to this situation and future gain, they had to give in for now. The man suggested that if he gave in to anger and fought back, the bride would clearly not be happy with this approach, and she agreed. Geoffrey said that he had other things to do now, and she could go shopping and buy herself some warm weather clothes since they might be late. The pink-haired girl asked if this was to be expected, and her fiancé turned to the palace, saying that given where things were heading, it was quite likely. Shaking his head as if in agreement with his own thoughts, the blonde man said that even if he was wrong, he needed to be prepared. Later, while walking through the emerald dressing room, Aurora informed her maid that she could choose her work clothes. This was good news for the maid. She was delighted. Angela stated that she wanted to stay in order to use her subordinate longer, and the pink-haired girl suggested that it was pleasant. Diverting from the topic, the future duchess rubbed the fabrics with her fingers and said that they differed from the northern ones in their properties. The girl said that it was thinner and colder, so she needed to replenish her supplies, and the maid asked what about the hat. Looking up and examining the item, Aurora wanted to say that it looked interesting, but she heard talk about her fiancé. She turned to the ladies who were standing behind and discussing the reasons for which His Majesty might have called Duke Ettica to the palace. The fair-haired lady said with delight that her brother had personally seen Geoffrey's carriage near the castle, adding that he had not been here for a very long time. Audrey whispered to her maid how these girls knew him, and Angela suggested that they might be in his fan club. The dark-haired lady suggested that Ruby had come all the way to see the Duke, and the other chimed in that it was exciting to see him again. Swallowing nervously, Aurora grabbed the maid by the elbow and pulled her towards the exit, saying that they had better leave before trouble ensued, and she objected that she was interested. The pink-haired girl herself turned around when she heard that the Duke would rush to Ruby as soon as he was free from business with the Emperor of the state. The blue-eyed lady with long blonde hair was confidently called by the girls the one and only beloved of Geoffrey. Ruby replied that they made her blush, and the fair-haired girl said that only such a beauty could be the Duke's true love. The ladies continued to giggle and smile as they chatted about how special she was, arguing that they needed to plan dinner. Aurora froze with an extremely displeased expression on her face, mentally thinking about the fact that the girl looked 10 years younger than him. Looking at Ruby, who said that they had no plans yet, the girl wondered if Ettica was considered so disgusting because of his passion for young ladies. The blonde seemed to be deep in thought, arguing that the man always took up the topic, and her friends readily picked up on any topic. Angela whispered that it was getting more and more interesting, and the pink-haired girl thought she felt like she was eavesdropping on her lover's betrayal. She heard the girls suddenly start talking about how the Duke now had a bride, and a lavish engagement ceremony was being held.